this situation is now, I mean, I say this day after frustrating day, to borrow the Prime Minister's phrase for it. This just gets worse and worse and worse, doesn't it? So figures from 2 days ago, 300 came across. You can assume 300 probably came across yesterday as well. Plus, we passed the 20,000 mark for the year. So they're coming and they're coming and they're coming. The Bibby Stockholm barge is just a joke now, an empty, rusting hulk with no one on board. So are all the migrant centres that Rishi promised us would be set up, you know, the disused air bases, the holiday camps, the former prisons. None of them are happening because of local protests. And today we learned, this is really shocking, 168 students at Huddersfield University who had their accommodation, their university accommodation, all sorted out for next term, which starts, of course, later in September, were turfed out to make room for migrants. So the hotels are still being commandeered. Now we know student accommodations. You've heard of migrant camps. Now you've got migrant campuses. Was it March when the Prime Minister stood in front of a lectern which said stop the boats and pledged, judge me on this, I will stop the boats? Not going well for him, is it?
No, it isn't. And you mentioned the Huddersfield case, and that sort of encapsulates the problem that we have. Essentially, students are paying the price for the government's over-reliance on private accommodation. They're paying the price for an asylum system that is completely out of control. And, you know, they followed the rules. They've got the grades. They've taken out the student loan. They've, you know, signed the tenancy agreements, and yet they're being gazumped by the Home Office, who are using their accommodation to house illegal economic migrants who essentially have spent a considerable amount of time outside of their home country, in a safe country in France. They've paid criminal gangs and human traffickers to be here, and yet they are being given preference over law-abiding British citizens or foreign students who have come here through legitimate means. It's terrible.
And what can be done about it? I mean, I keep saying, you know, isn't it time we started looking at the alternative methods of stopping them that the Prime Minister seems to refuse to embrace? For example, why don't we just put some of them on a plane and fly them to Rwanda and tell the European Court of Human Rights, well, we've done it. What are you going to do about it? We're the only country that belongs to the European Convention on Human Rights who sort of follow the rules, you know, implicitly. Other countries just ride roughshod over them all the time. So why don't we do that? Or, for example, why don't we start, instead of towing them into Britain, turning them round and taking them back to France? We need to do something different to what we've been doing so far, don't we?
That's an interesting question. In terms of Rwanda, we don't want the Home Secretary in contempt of court. I think you open a Pandora's box when you ignore the rule of law. You know, ultimately, that decision is going to come down to the Supreme Court. I'm quietly confident that they will rule in favour of the government. I'm not sure, but that could happen. In terms of the pushbacks or the pullbacks, as you can call them, that's very difficult across the English Channel because it's very narrow, and you'd have to operate in the contiguous zone. And these are not small boats, which is what we saw with Australia and Indonesia. These are actually dinghies. So to turn these around, you need, you know, jet skis, for example, which is what, you know, Priti Patel trialled. But if one of these dinghies actually capsizes, the UK Border Force will be liable for, you know, manslaughter.
But the thing is, though, I mean, I take your point, Mike. You know, obviously we don't want to put lives at risk, but I've never quite understood why it is that to turn the boats round and tow them back to France, that's lethal, really, really dangerous. To just grab hold of them and tow them the other way to Britain, that's not dangerous. I mean, where's the logic in that?
Well, there are two ways of doing the pushback policy. You can either sort of flip them around using the jet skis, which is what Priti Patel wanted, but that's very dangerous.
We
The
don't
other
need
way,
to use jet skis, do you? There are other ways of I mean, basically, we seem to sort of embrace them with RNLI boats or border patrol boats. So my point is, you know, we're always told terribly dangerous to turn them back. Well, why isn't it dangerous to help them continue their journey? It's the same distance.
Well, yeah, you could do that. You could actually put them onto larger vessels and take them back to Calais. That's an option. But the problem is you'd be violating French national sovereignty. You'd actually be going into their territory without their permission. You've got to remember with Australia and Indonesia, the Australians were operating in the high waters, not in the contiguous zone. The Australians, however, did violate Indonesian territory on a few occasions, but the Australian government had to issue a grovelling apology because of this. And it did create a sort of diplomatic issue between the two countries. I mean, the French could put their own boats out there and confront us in the English Channel. That's the problem, essentially, with a pushback policy if you don't have the bilateral agreement there.
Yeah, I mean, again, I'm taking on board all your points here, and yes, the Australians and the Indonesians ended up in something of a diplomatic incident over this, but the reason for this contretemps was because the Australians took a very hardline attitude, and whatever happened along the way, they ended up winning this, and then migrants don't come anymore because they sent the right message. So what I'm saying is, aren't we really at the point where international legal niceties you know, have to go down the agenda, and realities have to take over, because you know this is a disaster, and it's getting worse and worse and worse. How can we stop it, Mike?
Yeah, I mean, the issue is we're signed up to all sorts of, you know, international maritime laws, you know, like SOLAS and the UN law of the sea. So it's very difficult to push back without being prosecuted if a dinghy capsizes. How do we stop this? Well, you know, this is going to sound like a bit of a cliche, but it ultimately comes down to the Supreme Court decision on Rwanda. Now, because of the Illegal Migration Act, if you're from a safe country, we can detain and deport you pretty quickly. So if you're from, you know, Albania, Bosnia, for example, you came here via a dinghy, we could send you back. But the problem is the vast majority of migrants who are crossing the channel are from countries that are deemed unsafe. So you need that third safe country to deport them to. If the Supreme Court rules in favor of the government, then, you know, operationally, we can begin removing these people, and that will provide a deterrent, assuming that the deportations are high enough.